Thank you guys so much for coming today. Today we are actually going to talk about a little known killer. I don't know, has anybody here heard of Ted Bundy before? Are we at the right place? Okay, of course we have. So there's definitely a draw to Ted Bundy. I think all of us are here for pretty much the same reason. I am a true crime author. My name is Hammon, and I have been obsessed with Bundy for the past 20 plus years. I've actually been writing a blog about him for the past 13 years. I was initially drawn in by Ann Rule's book, Stranger Beside Me, and so from there it was all downhill. The obsession was real. So I'm an author, and I just really wanted to come here to dispel some of the mythology about Ted Bundy, who he really was, as opposed to how the public often sees him and how the media will portray him. And now my colleague Abigail will give you a little more information.
Hello, my name is Abigail. I've been kind of obsessed, same as EJ Bundy, for the past 5 years, so I don't have as much history, I guess, with Bundy as EJ does, but I have really been researching him. My area of interest with Bundy is specifically more the psychology, kind of his development in the psychology, and as well as the victims. Professionally, I am a death investigator, and so for me, digging into the victims' case files and kind of revisiting those has been really where I have found a lot of my interest.
Absolutely. The way we got to know each other, I was actually working with an individual on a book about Ted Bundy, and we are hoping to have it published by the end of this year. It's called Ted Bundy, Memories of the Beast. And my co-author reached out to Abigail, and she was kind enough to provide some photos from her trip to Washington State, where she did visit a lot of places where Bundy was known to have been, where he grew up, where one of his potential victims lived. And so she had this great information of actually being on site where Bundy had been before. So we started talking, and she did provide photos for the book, so once that book's out, her pictures from Washington State will be in there. Also, I had traveled to Colorado and actually seen the two places where Bundy escaped. So the more we talked, the more we realized we each had an experience in the world of Bundy. And so we needed to present this information to you as far as what it was like being in those places. But we also want to talk about some of the other places where Bundy killed as well. So I do want to ask everybody, and just answer aloud, how many people did Ted Bundy kill?
We don't know.
A lot.
33 officially.
Okay.
Official.
It's really kind of a trick question.
Probably like 333.
So Tim, yeah, that's a good answer, but the truth is nobody really knows. There's been speculation that he could have killed over 100, though that seems a bit high. We will talk about some of the suspected victims. The police were able, when talking with Bundy, to confirm 30. That he did not know the names of 10 of them, so they were able to confirm the names of 20 of his victims. So, how many people here remember driving in the 1970s?
There we go.
That's not great.
Really?
Actual driving or
Do you remember riding? You remember riding?
Yes,
Okay.
riding.
Excellent. So you probably remember whether you rode or you drove, that driving in the 70s was very different from driving now. As far as a highway system alone, the highway system is relatively new in the United States. Eisenhower signed it into law in 1956. And so when we think of driving, for most of us, we don't even think about how it started. So with Bundy, you'll see that he used the highway system frequently. He was on and off the highway constantly. Can anyone guess the longest interstate highway in the United States?
66. Route 1. I-90.
Who said that?
66.
You are correct. I-90. I-90, let's bring up our... I'll show you. Right. So, I-90 does go between Seattle and Boston, and it comes in at 3,020 miles. Now, I'm from North Carolina. I thought it would be I-40. I-40 is only 2,500 miles, so that was a surprise
How far
to me.
is 55?
I don't know.
Which that's a lot shorter off.
Right. So yeah, so I-90 is our longest. Does anyone know how long the entire highway system is in the United States?
Like including all of them?
All of them.
Oh, damn.
I had no idea when I looked this up. It comes to a total of 46,000 miles for all of our highway systems. All right, so this question is for Bundy Bookmark. Can you name the make and model of the vehicle that Bundy drove?
Bug.
You got it. All right, we got one more of these. Who can name the year of the vehicle?
1977.
73. 69.
68.
71.
68.
Me?
Yes, you.
I mean, you listed everything.
I should have anticipated that. All right.
I mean, it's the same number.
So we gotta give everybody else a chance, so you guys be patient. So, much like Ted Bundy's favorite form of transport, the VW Beetle was like most cars during this era. That's an actual photo I took at the Crime and Punishment Museum in Washington, D.C. before it shut down. And you can see you could actually get a lot closer than you can now at the Alcatraz East Museum. So with his vehicle, two doors, right? A lot of these smaller cars are two doors, but in the 70s, most of the cars were two door, unless you had a family car. So a college student was most likely to have a two-car vehicle, and with Ted, it was probably easy for him to get in and out when he carried his, what he called, cargo. Anybody say what the cargo was that he was constantly carrying? His bodies, exactly. Now, when we think of safety in driving, we usually imagine the seatbelt that crosses our lap and our chest. In fact, some cars now will automatically put your chest strap across you. However, in the 70s, you were lucky to get a seatbelt across your lap. Anybody remember that? Exactly. And I think it would feel pretty strange for most of us. The only thing comparable I can think of is when you're on an airplane. Maybe you've got the little strap, which really doesn't feel like you're doing much there. However, with Bundy's vehicle, if you look over here near the hand strap, you can see that it actually was a chest strap. So the 1968 Beetle, the standard, did have the chest strap across. So it was actually one of the earliest vehicles with that type of seatbelt in the car. We do think about one of the victims who was able to escape, and she was asked to put on the seatbelt and she refused. She would have had difficulty trying to fight him off with that, wearing that seatbelt.
Yeah, that's really made like all the difference in that case, which we'll discuss later. But
Absolutely.
very good point.
Absolutely. And of course, forget about hooking up your favorite streaming system when you were driving in the 70s. You were stuck listening to the radio, 4 to 8 tracks. Anybody remember 8 tracks?
Yeah.
Really? We take so much for granted. And really at that time, you were just kind of at the mercy of whatever was on the 8-track or was on the radio. I do remember that my father had a 78 Toyota station wagon that only had AM radio, and it had no air conditioning. I cannot imagine. Of course, if you're like me, you have no sense of direction. Anybody here have no sense of direction? I have none. Okay. However, since the invention of the GPS, we've been heavily reliant on that type of assistance when we travel. However, in the 1970s, you were expected to either travel using a map or find your own way. Of course, when you see some of the maps and how Ted traveled, you'll understand a little more about how he made that work. And finally, does anyone here remember those old credit card machines that you would use you'd slide to record your information? So of course, that was the only way you were going to pay using a credit card back in the 70s. Ted did have a gas card that he used to travel a lot. He was obsessed with getting gas. And you have to wonder, a lot of times he was not good with money. We know that's true of a lot of psychopaths. And so, of course, with that, the reader was not automatic. So it may take 2 or 3 days before the company knew that his credit card had come back and he had not been able to pay for his gas. Before we get into the heart of Bundy's travels, I do want to talk a little bit about what criminal investigations were like during this era. This was during an era where serial killers were emerging as a phenomenon in the United States, but police departments throughout the country were finding it difficult to identify them. Since serial killers are known for primarily killing strangers and having few ties to their victims, you can imagine how difficult it was for police departments that didn't talk to each other, or even those who did, they were very limited in the technology that they had to communicate. It was a phone, maybe a fax machine if you were lucky. These were two of the investigators that worked on the Bundy case at the time. We had Bob Keppel from Washington State, King County Police Department, and we had Mike Fisher over here from Colorado. So as I mentioned, during the 70s, when Ted was on the prowl, lack of communication between law enforcement did make it difficult to connect the crimes of the serial killers, serial offenders. And with Ted's history and knowledge of police departments, we'll go into a little bit, he was able to use that to his advantage when it came to getting away with his crimes. He was sorry. You pulled that one, Laura, but that's okay. So I'm not sure it's on the internet, but if you think about it, I mean, this is Ted looking ever so debonair. And it does also remind us here that the VW Beetle, the engine was in the back, and the trunk was in the front. And so as you see, there we go. Okay, but at that time there really weren't that many cars that were like this. I don't know if it was just German engineering or quite what happened, but yeah. So that was a little bit different there. But now you can see what he must have looked like too. The first officer that found that information. So Ted was known to travel a great deal, and you will see that in this presentation, so much that his crimes were connected for a long time. In fact, until the famed Aspen Summit, where Bob Keppel, Jerry Thompson, and Mike Fisher, and 30 other investigators met, they were able to compare notes on each area's crime sprees, and before then, very little sharing had occurred between the departments. Serial killing differs greatly from other types of murder in that most serial killing victims are strangers. Therefore, investigators had no leads to follow to suss out their culprit. Ted didn't know any of the women that he killed, and because he left little forensic evidence behind, often wearing gloves and a ski mask, detectives had little to go on. In fact, when investigators searched his room in his Salt Lake City room, he lived in a rooming house, no usable fingerprints were located, not even Bundy's prints. Now when you think about what that must mean about what he was doing when he was living in that room, he had to have been constantly wiping down, removing hair from his hairbrush, and that was probably not just preventative, it was probably part of his obsessive compulsive disorder. You'll see he had other features of that as well. Something notable about what's called the Ted Murders investigation, and it was called that after he used his real name at one of the crime scenes, was the use of a computer in collating suspect names and vehicles. So by the 70s, computers had come a long way, but they were still rudimentary compared to what we have now. Washington State Police had a large amount of data. They realized that they needed to figure out a way to collate it. So they turned to their payroll computer, something that wasn't used for this type of thing, and they were able to start to organize all the tips and all the names that had come in on the Ted murders. One of the lists actually, Ted's name was actually listed on a list along with 25 other men, and at the time that he was arrested the first time, he was actually the name at the top. So it was just a matter of time before he would have been called in. And this was after his arrest and the attempted kidnapping of Carol Durant. Something else that benefited Bundy was he didn't look like a killer. That was where this slide came in here. He looked very normal. He was clean cut, wore nice clothing. He appeared to have a great deal of ambition. Some people thought he was good looking. I've never understood that personally. I don't find him attractive, and I think there's also, of course, knowing what he did that's on top of that as well. He never had problems getting dates. In fact, he dated even when he was in relationships. He was a dedicated Republican, and his ambition to become a lawyer made him seem motivated to outsiders. So he had a party with which he was affiliated, and he wanted to be a law student. So he did seem to be a very law-abiding citizen.
Did he go to law school?
I'm sorry?
Did he actually go to law school?
He did go to law school, yes. And in fact, we'll actually get into some of his life history. That will go into that a little bit. Good question. So for all the limitations that science provided during Bundy's active killing spree, it was eventually linked to several murders through small things that built up over time. He was identified in police lineup of attempted kidnapping victim Carol DeRanch. The handcuffs that were linked to DeRanch's kidnapping was tied to Debbie Kemp's murder. He used his real first name, at the Lake Sammamish abduction site among crowds of people. His girlfriend Liz reported him twice to police. But of course, his mistakes and cockiness were really what got him arrested and ended his killing spree. It wouldn't have been possible to tie him to the crimes without the dedication of the hardworking detectives and officers who worked tirelessly to bring him to justice.
Okay, so Ted's, can everyone hear me first of all, right off the bat? All right, perfect.
You want me to?
Yeah, that'd be great. So Ted's kind of story starts in Burlington, Vermont. Yeah, we didn't have, I can.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
He was born at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers to his mother, Louise Cowell. Anyone who kind of is familiar with Bundy, or maybe the details of his birth, know that he was born illegitimate, thus being born at the Elizabeth Lund Home. There's also a lot of discrepancies about who his father was. I know that there's a lot of theories going around as far as, his mother listing two different people that might have been his father. Anyways, I'm not going to get caught up in the semantics, the details about that, because the reality is we don't have access at this point to Ted Bundy's original birth certificate. We do just know that he was born illegitimate. I do have a slide that shows here is sorry, 1 second. So this is the documentation that shows that his mother Louise actually put Ted up for adoption briefly. She left him at the home, put him up for adoption, and then a month later returned to the Elizabeth Lund home and changed her mind. She then brought Ted home with her, and at this point, at 4 years old, Louise moves with Ted to the West Coast, and they move to Washington. First, they arrive at Browns Point, Washington, then they move to Tacoma. And then if we have a picture of, the next slide shows, so this is Louise, Ted's mother, and those are his, 3 of his 4 siblings. And then at this point, Louise is married to Johnny Bundy, and Johnny Bundy actually adopts Ted, thus the name.
I think it's important to note here that some people reference Johnny as the stepfather. He was briefly, but he actually was Ted's adopted father, so it's accurate to call him his father, even though it wasn't genetic.
Right.
And those siblings were his half-siblings. Legally, they were his full siblings.
Right. Thanks for that. No, honestly. Thank you, though.
Yeah.
So yeah, we have Ted's half-siblings there, Sandra, Glenn, and...
So Ted's in the bow tie? The younger one?
What's that?
Is Ted the younger one?
That's Glenn.
That's Glenn with the bow tie. So Ted is actually the eldest in the back here. There's quite an age difference between him and his half-siblings. So he really took on a fatherly role with the youngest son, which is Rich Bundy. Anyways, there was quite an age difference there. But so he kind of really, 15 years age difference. But he was very close to Rich. They went on a lot of camping trips, and you'll kind of see later on, kind of in the presentation too, where when Bundy is with his long-term girlfriend, she has a daughter, Molly, And they would often go on camping trips with Bundy and his brother Rich. So it was a little family unit that, yeah. So that brings us to Anne Marie.
Absolutely. Is anyone familiar with the young girl that went missing when Ted Bundy was 14? You heard the story? There was little is known about his earliest crimes. Now, this was a young girl, she was 8 years old, who went missing in Tacoma, Washington on August 30th, 1961. And she was actually abducted from her home, this house in Tacoma, and she's never been found. There's no sign of her. She was actually removed from her home, and there was very little evidence left behind. Now, we do know that Bundy admitted to authorities that by age 14, he had already become a peeping Tom, and he liked to go through his neighbor's trash cans in order to try and find porn magazines. We also know that he killed girls as young as 12 in his adult years. It's highly possible that his desires actually began pretty early in life. Though he only ever admitted to killings between 1972 and 1973, though his earliest confirmed murder was 1974, much has been made of the unsolved abduction that occurred in his Tacoma neighborhood. Anne Marie Burr lived only 8 blocks away from the Bundy home, and there's no question that Ted knew her. When the young girl went missing from the 2-story home, her mother recalled that the daughter had gone into her bedroom earlier in the evening, and her mother later returned her to her own bed. By 5:30 in the morning, she was missing. Her parents discovered the front door slightly ajar and noted their living room window was open. Despite an area-wide search for her and various suspects questioned by police, neither an arrest was made nor was her body found. And though he seemed like a likely suspect years later, Ted Bundy wasn't initially considered for the crime. He was only suggested as a suspect after he was in prison, and officials realized that he had lived so close to Anne Marie at the time of her abductions. Police surmised that her kidnapper's quick, silent movement throughout the house showed a familiarity with the layout of the house. The company did keep their first floor window cracked to let in the night breeze, and the abductor had pushed their garden bench beneath the window for leverage. Once he climbed through the window, he didn't realize he left a damp imprint of his size 6 or 7 shoe print on the bench. Think about what size that is for a male. Pretty small, maybe a 14-year-old would have worn it. And the window actually caught a thread from his red shirt. The only resident within the house who was leery was the family dog who barked during the night, but it did little to ruffle the intruder. He slipped upstairs to where the little girl slept. She shared a room with her 3-year-old sister, and he took her hand and led her down the stairs and walked her out the front door. And through the years, a lot of people have thought that Ted Bundy did commit this act. She did live in the neighborhood, and she also took piano lessons from Ted's Uncle Jack Cowell for 2 years, who you can see here on your right. That's his uncle. And if you really look clearly at him, he looks very much like Ted. Ted favored his mother's side of the family without question. Ted would have also passed the little girl's house on his paper route. He did deny, when asked about this, he denied actually committing a crime. The mother of the young girl actually reached out to ask him to confess, and he denied it again. So we do know that he was prowling, that he could have been developing desires to climb into his victims' homes, as he did later in his crime spree. Those were some of the earliest known crimes where he would actually go into the home instead of luring the victim to him. I do think it's interesting that, and we find out in the newest edition of The Phantom Prince, the book by Ted's fiancée, Liz Klepper, her daughter did write a foreword for it and alleged inappropriate behavior with Ted when she was 7. So it seems like that could have been something that he was engaged in at that time. We can't rule it out.
So we wanted to insert kind of at this point in the timeline the topic of voyeurism, because as we're discussing Anne Marie Burr, possible victim, we know that his voyeurism was kind of a developing thing for several years. So, for anyone who doesn't know what voyeurism is, not to be condescending, but I just want to be sure. The practice of gaining sexual pleasure from watching others when they are naked or engaged in sexual activity. And so, Ted Bundy was open about this. You know, he had no hesitations about telling investigators that this was how things really started for him. He was known to, I actually want to read some excerpts from various psychological evaluations and interviews because it really highlights his psychology in these different stages of voyeurism. The two specific psychological evaluations that I want to kind of refer to would be from Dr. Al Carlisle, and then, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth, who did a lot of interviews with Ted Bundy, up to like 100 hours with him, which is insane. So Ted explains that prior to canvassing homes and neighborhoods where he lived, he felt that his exposure to violent imagery and literature gave rise to his interest in the kind of sexual activity involving violence that would gradually begin to absorb his fantasies. He would fantasize schemes, kind of like a mental exercise and imagination for like isolating his victims. So examples like letting air out of a girl's tire or loosening like their gas caps, would then put them in a vulnerable position where then he would need to come to their aid, and then he would be able to subdue them. Ted then speaks to his voyeurism in that he would spend hours at night finding open windows where he could witness women undressing. The interesting part of this stage in his development is that he notes the importance of maintaining his social work, or his social and work responsibilities, making sure to never postpone a date or miss a day of work. His activities at this point were still dictated by his lifestyle, so he wouldn't necessarily rearrange his life to accommodate his voyeurism, kind of trying to still blend in while, feeding this fascination, or, this fantasy he had. Over time, very slowly, is how Ted describes, quote, a predisposition for violence becoming a disposition that demands more of his time. Further stating that it wasn't something he could flip on and off like a switch, it was just a state of mind that eventually became strong enough that his only approach was to conceal it and not let it interfere to a point where he would escalate to a point of being caught or detected. He lays out numerous variables that may or may not have collectively played parts in the manifestation of his fantasies, but they're very loosely defined and not very convincing. Ted is adamant that there was never a single traumatic event or underlying hostility toward women that triggered his decision to act out his fantasies. I tend to disagree with that a little bit. We see,
I love it.
Yeah, we see the brutality that he put his victims through, and it's hard to imagine that he would commit these acts of brutality if he didn't have some kind of aggression towards women. But Ted being Ted, he reflects positively on the women in his life and the women who shared a role in raising him, his aunts specifically that raised him till the age of 4 in Philadelphia. He insists several hypotheticals that there's no way for anyone to detect that a person will become violent or decide to murder, let alone himself. Ted recalls a few of his first attempted assaults once he escalated past the point of voyeurism. And he explains that with each of these kind of scenarios, there was less and less time required of him to recover from kind of the shock or the physiological distress he experienced after doing so. Okay, so real quickly, because this can get really dense.
Yeah.
But there are 3 kind of specific incidences that he mentions were his first initial attacks. One was he saw a woman park her car, and she approached her door and fumbled with her keys. And at that point, he realized her vulnerability of dropping her keys. He picked up a piece of wood and struck her, but she fell down and began to scream, and he panicked. He at this point has not established an MO or kind of any confidence in attacking women, but he is crossing that line from fantasy to acting out.
Can you imagine someone following you and just hitting you and running?
I do
I mean,
think
it's
go to room.
it's brutal.
It's terrifying. So he reports after that initial attack, it took him 6 months to really recover, and that he did as much as he could to avoid getting to that state of mind again. He immersed himself in politics. He tried to really dive deeply into academics because he felt like that was the only thing that could redeem or maybe validate what he had done. Also telling himself, you know, like, I'm never going to do that again. You know, like, I'm just going to tell myself that. And obviously we know that he could not suppress that. All right, so now we are at, here's Ted, high school. So in 1965, he graduates from Woodrow Wilson High School in Tacoma, Washington. At this time, he's living with his mom, Louise, and his stepdad, Johnny Bundy, at Skyline Drive in Tacoma. And he starts attending his first year of college at Puget Sound University. His mode of transportation at this time is likely by foot or bicycle. As EJ mentioned, he had a paper route. And then after kind of that first freshman year of college at Puget Sound, Ted was disappointed. He quotes, "I felt that the students put too much emphasis on fraternity and sorority activities. I didn't have money or social standing to get into them. At the end of the school year, I had to break away. I hadn't found what I wanted." So that leads him to attend the University of Washington in Seattle in the fall of '66.
Now in '66, there were two women who were living in Seattle, and they were working as flight attendants for United. I don't know if anybody's flown United. That's how I got here.
Where are you from?
North Carolina. Thank you. So two young women, Lonnie Trumbull and Lisa Wick, both 20. They were in their Seattle apartment in the early morning hours. You will learn that Bundy loved to be out in the middle of the night committing his crimes. When Ted was 19 years old. They were both brutally bludgeoned. Lonnie, the brunette, did not make it. Lisa survived, and they believe the only reason after being bludgeoned that she survived was because she had those big heavy curlers in her head, on her head, and she slept in those curlers, and that probably saved her life. There was no forced entry found, and the front door was unlocked when their third roommate arrived at home at 9:30 the next morning. The victims were still in bed, covered in blood. There was a handprint found near the apartment door, but it was not matched to anyone. So it was compared to Bundy eventually, and it was not matched to him. Of course, that doesn't mean that it wasn't him. There was lumber found nearby, which Bundy had been known to use in the past, with blood on it. Wick, the survivor, did identify the attacker as a white male, 5'10". Bundy was 5'10", 165 with thinning blonde hair. Of course, he wasn't blonde, but it was dark. And witness identification is really sketchy at best. Bob Keppel, who we saw earlier with the King County Sheriff's Department, asked Bundy about the case, and Bundy denied it. Of course, this is the initial style of attack that Bundy did prefer. Of course, whether he started his killing career in '66, '61, or '74, he seemed to want to start out with blitz attacks in the women's home.
Okay, so as I mentioned, we're now in Seattle. He's attending Washington University. Then in the summer of '67, Ted actually starts taking classes at Stanford University. He's staying in Palo Alto, so he's down in California. The reason this is important is because Ted had admitted in 1989, when speaking to detectives, that there was one unconfirmed victim in California. We still do not know who that victim is, but I think it's important to know at the time that he is in California, because then you're able to kind of narrow it down and look at, some persons reports, looking at kind of similar victims that experience kind of a similar MO, but we do not know still to this day who that victim was. In September, after taking his summer courses at Stanford University, Ted moves back to Seattle, starts working at the Seattle Yacht Club. He also enrolls at the University of Washington again. Then in 1968, he shifts from academic life to traveling. And this is where he's just kind of all over the place, doing a lot of exploration, maybe trying to find who he is, where his niche is. He travels between January and March, spending time skiing in Aspen, Vail, and Denver, Colorado. He then flies back out to the East Coast, where his aunts are living in Philadelphia, and lived there for some time. And then he also traveled to Arkansas to visit his Uncle Jeff for about a week before returning to Seattle. This is where he really immerses himself in politics. Sorry, I keep forgetting my slides. Stanford. All right. So in 1968, this is, like I mentioned, he's immersing himself in politics. It was something that has always interested him. He worked for the Dan Evans campaign for governor and the Arthur Fletcher campaign for lieutenant governor in Washington State, thank you. And Ted was Arthur Fletcher's personal driver.
Was he killing people during all that? Or was that, does anyone know?
Yeah, so during 68, with all this travel, like EJ mentioned, the Trumbull,
Lonnie Trumbull.
Yeah. So that was a suspected, unconfirmed or suspected situation, but we don't know for sure. There aren't any for certain victims in 1968. But noting his travels is very important because, so he's also working on the Nelson Rockefeller campaign, the headquarters being downtown Seattle. And then in August, Bundy actually attended the Republican National Convention in Miami. So that's the one connection to Florida that we see. And obviously later we'll have a Florida connection too. So then he is enrolled at Temple University in Philadelphia from January to May, working on political science.
This is 69.
In 69. And at that time, while he's attending Temple University, he's living with his aunts, the Cowles. And that leads us to Ocean City.
On May 30th, 1969, Susan Davis and Elizabeth Perry, both 19 years old in Ocean City, New Jersey, went missing. We do know at that time Bundy was still at Temple University in Philadelphia, so it's not a very long drive to get from Philadelphia to Ocean City, New Jersey. Both of the women were stabbed. Again, that would not necessarily be off-brand for someone who's trying out what might work for him. Whether he's bludgeoning, stabbing, he may be trying different techniques. It took 3 days to locate their bodies, which were found just 10 feet away from each other. Susan Davis was found nude, while Elizabeth Perry was found clothed. Elizabeth is the blonde, Susan is the brunette. Bundy did tell forensic psychiatrist Art Norman that his first victims were 2 women in the Philadelphia area. However, Bundy's aunt stated that Ted had his leg in a cast that weekend after a car wreck, but he's still a strong suspect. How many of us have gotten the date wrong on something when we're convinced that it's true? Bundy did state to Dr. Dorothy Lewis about this era later on that same year in the spring. I went to Ocean City, New Jersey, and just hanging out at the beach, looking at the young women, which is creepy coming from Ted, and trailing them around. And my plan was, I'd never done anything like this before. It was very confusing and fearful, and yet I felt compelled to sort of act out this vision. I know that I, in Ocean City, realized just how inept I was, and so that made me more cautious, and so I didn't do that again for a long time. Though it's still just a suspicion, we know that wherever Bundy went, people died.
So he then returns to the West Coast sometime in May of around 69, so. To the West Coast sometime in May. He spends time with friends, so again, another San Francisco, California related time period for him. He spends time with friends and lived with them for a while before then moving to Tacoma between May and September. Then in September, the fall, he's returned to Seattle. and he's attending the University of Washington. Sorry, this is him. Our slides got a little bit out of order. This is at the National Republican Convention.
Like in a university, smart.
Right.
You seem to be a professional student.
How did he find time to?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Did he work?
He didn't like to work, that's for sure.
He didn't like to work, but he had a lot of really odd jobs. Like you can see, like as we go forward, he's getting actual like government jobs, and he's working on political campaigns. But then there's these weird ones, like for example, when he's kind of making his way back from the west or the East Coast, he's in Tacoma for a period of time working at a lumber mill. I mean, like imagining Ted Bundy at a lumber mill.
Doing hard
is
work.
Really odd. The Seattle Yacht Club as a valet. He worked at like a Safeway stocking shelves. He was a security officer down in Utah at the university. So it's really all over the place. And you'll see that, maintaining a job for him was important while he was committing his murders, because he needed to have, he needed to have some part of him that was normal, felt solidified. So then we have,
Can anybody name the young woman that Ted Bundy had a relationship with for a good 7 years, and who wrote a book about him? Anybody can name her? First name?
Elizabeth?
Whoever said Elizabeth, that's correct.
yay,
Come on, get your. It'd been one.
forgot to sprinkle one question.
Yeah, I know.
There's just so much information. I want to get,
Good job.
awesome. So yeah, we
Is it
have,
okay that we're asking questions, or I am? I'm not like.
yeah, no, that's
You're
fine.
not missing out purple over again.
No, this is awesome.
So so we have, this is his rooming house, the east side of the University of Washington campus. There's a picture there of his girlfriend Liz and daughter Molly. Sandpaper Tavern is where they met in the fall of 1970.
And here's the book that she wrote.
Yeah. Okay, so 1970. It's not a lot in 1970. I think a lot of the 1970 for him was spending time with Molly, his stepdaughter. Well, they were never married.
They weren't.
But he treated her as such. And Liz. He was also, he took a trip to Utah. Liz's parents, important to note that Liz's parents actually lived in Utah. So they would visit often, for holidays and stuff. So he did have some ties to Utah. And then in 1971 is kind of the first time we hear from a girlfriend that separate from Liz. Bundy was working at Seattle Crisis Clinic, so people were calling in with mental health concerns, looking for help on his phone line. And Bundy happened to be dating a woman that also worked at the crisis center. And this girlfriend did relay that Bundy was not good at his job. It's not very surprising. People would call in, he was very impatient, he was short with them, dismissive. And the same girlfriend also reported that she had an encounter with Bundy, and this is the first time we hear from a girlfriend who's reporting that he's disassociating kind of during sexual encounters, to the point where she was very terrified in the encounter they had and felt like if he had not come out of his disassociation, she very well would have been victimized. So in his timeline, this is a very important key point. It's again yet another stage in his development from voyeurism to attacks to kind of this disassociation.
When we think of 1971, in July, there was a young woman in Burlington, Vermont, Rita Curran. She was 24. She was both an elementary school teacher and she worked part-time in a motel that was actually close to the Lund home for unwed mothers where Ted Bundy was born. He was born in Burlington, Vermont. And the young woman was strangled, bludgeoned, and raped in her home. She was found by her roommate. It's key to note her home was also near the University of Vermont. Bundy actually advised Dr. Lewis when she was evaluating him later, there would be acting out, and then let's say this first incident in '69, we talked about the Ocean City murders. It was 2 years later before I did another one, 1971, and then 6 months later before I tried to kill another one, and then finally the first. A little bit vague there, but he is still suspected in the murder, although there are a lot of other viable suspects in this particular murder.
So in 1972, it's a really heavy academic year for him. He's focusing on his degree, involved in more political campaigns. He starts working at the Mental Health Center in Harborview Hospital in Seattle. June 10th, he graduates from University of Washington with a Bachelor of Science in Psychology. He did not ever obtain a degree in law, although he did go to school for law. I'll talk about that later. That's in Utah. And then he also, he starts working on the Seattle Crime Commission. He's the assistant director. The irony of this is that one of their initiatives was a problem called Speak Out on Rape, kind of awareness about rape in the community. And Ted Bundy actually made a pamphlet on that topic of rape. So
Think about the irony.
that it's just
Someone who is a rapist that's
Yeah.
telling women
Yeah.
how not to be raped.
right. The irony is thick. Then in 1973, he's working in King County, the Law and Justice Planning Office, and this is when he purchases his infamous 1968 Volkswagen. Up until this point, he was borrowing vehicles from friends. He was, mobile by foot, bicycle. So this is his first car. This picture, actually, I like a lot because it shows, a couple vehicles that he had access to. The first one being his Volkswagen. The one behind it, if you can see, it's kind of like a light greenish color. That is his girlfriend Liz's Volkswagen that he was known to use. And then in the way back, you can see a white pickup truck. And that he didn't own for very long. It was a pickup truck he purchased prior to moving to Utah and then sold shortly after being in Utah. Then he starts working for the Republican Party, and this is kind of an interesting point because he's commuting from Seattle to Olympia kind of on a daily basis at this point.
Like what, a 40-minute drive or something?
So it was
It's a good question. I wouldn't be able to say exactly, but it's roughly about half an hour.
So what can you say about a VW Bug? First of all, does anybody know what the German term Volkswagen means?
Folks.
Both.
Good job.
Good job.
The word in German literally means the people's car. Volkswagen. That's right. It was a very popular car in the United States in the 60s and 70s. And if you think about it, it was just such an ordinary looking car. It was, the interior there, it was tan, and he looked like any other college student or professor going back and forth with those cars. Of course, the Beetle is very gas efficient, but he never had any money. And it's very quick because it's a very lightweight car. Of course, with Bundy, you consider the fact that you could easily remove the seats. The passenger seat was constantly removed in his vehicle because that's where he would put his victims when he traveled from the abduction site to wherever he wanted to kill them and rape them. And it's actually very easy to remove the seat from its track. You just have to undo a hook and undo a little lever, and you can pull it right out. So he was actually arrested with, the officer found the passenger seat in his back seat.
So, don't mind. So at this time, he's still with his girlfriend.
Yes, they were together from 69 to 76.
So he would reinstall and reinstall the seat as they were together? Did she ever know, reading this book, that...
She found some things underneath his seat once. I believe she found the handcuffs and something else that just was out of place. But yeah, she actually did turn him into the police a couple times. But of course, I'm sure he tried to make it look like, you know, he hadn't done anything in the car, even though he probably used her car at some point
How did he
to.
keep them on the floor? Like, how did he keep them back?
Sometimes they woke up, if he didn't kill them from hitting them over the head with the tire iron, sometimes he'd have to hit them again.
But it was also very important to him, and if we can get to it, that he kept his victims alive. So he would only hit them hard enough to have them be unconscious. He did not want his victims communicating with him. He did not want the humanization of that, because that would deter his fantasy and kind of, you know, distract from what his goals and intentions were. So now we're 1973. This is when he confessed to his first homicide. We do not know, did not give any details about that homicide, aside from when detective asked him how that victim was killed. He said that it was by manual strangulation, which is different from his that he eventually establishes. Actually, 1974, his first victim, Karen Sparks. So Karen Sparks lived in an apartment just a couple blocks from his rooming house in Seattle. She was bludgeoned with a metal rod and then sexually assaulted with either the same or similar metal rod. Karen was left in extreme pain. She relays in a documentary called Falling for a Killer that she was left for 18 hours before she was found by her roommate. She was unable to call for help and was left bleeding out for hours. I'm sorry to say that. She survived, but she suffered significant lifelong injuries, including the loss of hearing in one ear, reconstructive surgery, repair of her bladder and reproductive organs, and physical therapy and speech, physical therapy to help her learn to walk again, and speech therapy. So that would be Bundy's first victim. We then have Linda Ann Healy, also lived about 5 blocks from Ted Bundy's rooming house in the U District of Seattle. She was known to frequent Dante's Tavern. She also was actually in classes that Bundy took. She took some psychology classes, so there is a little bit of, you know, kind of debate of did he know her, did he stalk her, but I tend to think that she was still somewhat random. So in this one, this is where kind of how EJ was mentioning early, he would like to go into people's homes and kind of commit like a blitz attack. But what's really odd about the Linda Ann Healy situation is that he snuck into a side door that he had previously known to be open. So he must have been canvassing this home to know that the door was open and he could get into this basement. She was bludgeoned, but then when people came to kind of survey the scene, it looked as if, you know, the room was undisturbed. There was no evidence of someone breaking and entering. They really couldn't figure out where Linda had gone. It was unlike her to, you know, be missing and not report to family and friends. And it wasn't until they peeled back the bed sheets where they spotted some blood on the mattress that they started to kind of think, well, gee, maybe she had a bloody nose, like what's going on? Then they discovered that it was like a nightgown was placed in her closet, like hung up neatly, but it had blood on it. So then there was kind of this skepticism of like, well, you know, later we find out that he had taken her clothes, changed her clothes, then transported her to his Volkswagen and brought her to Taylor Mountain, which is about 23 minutes from her location in Seattle. We then, I don't know how much,
Just keep it.
okay. So then we have the next victim. We have Abigail Manson, sorry. And Bundy's still living in Seattle at this time, same apartment. The interesting, I guess, thing about the Donna Manson case is that Ted Bundy had a friend that also attended Evergreen State Campus, which is where Donna Manson was attending college. And that friend worked on the Republican team. So Bundy would often go to the Evergreen State College and play racquetball with his friend. His name was Thomas Sampson. So he did spend some time there, although Bundy did admit that this particular victim was a victim of opportunity, that he did not know the victim. A really kind of odd admittance on Bundy's behalf with detectives in 1989 when they asked Bundy about, well, where is this victim? Is this victim on Taylor Mountain with the other victims? And he said, well, she is in the Cascades, but he reported that he had decapitated her, brought her head back to his girlfriend's apartment, so Liz, long-term girlfriend, and there he had burned up the remains of her skull.
They put the skull in the fireplace, yes.
Like in a box, he brought it back in a box.
I have no idea how he transported it back aside from, you know, in his car. So I should imagine some kind of bag or some kind of case. Another interesting thing about this case is that, well, I'm just gonna, sorry, there's so much information. I wish we had a lot more time. But,
Yeah.
Okay, so then next victim we have is Susan Rancourt. She's a college student at Central Washington State College. Again, Bundy has another connection here. He has a childhood, lifelong friend named Terry Storwick, who attended Central Washington State College as well. He would often visit this campus, but again, admits it's a victim of opportunity. The drive from his Seattle apartment to Ellensburg, the drive from Ellensburg to then Taylor Mountain, where he brings Rancourt, is an hour and a half. And this is where we start to see he's not just attacking victims within like these, blocks of his home, his residence. He's kind of driving further out and traveling these long distances. And the thing that EJ and I often wonder about, research and talk about is these long drives. What was happening? What was his mental state? Did he intentionally seek out these long drives because of an anticipation? Was it, any number of things?
Was he trying to not only get further away from home so he wouldn't be detected, but also what was he thinking about? Was he doing anything else, stopping to commit crimes? Was he looking for victims, or we know that in the future he will just pick up people at random who were either walking or hitchhiking. So any number of these trips could have involved that, we just don't have the information.
And you'll see on this, it's not super detailed, but on this map here, it's pretty desolate. Like between Ellensburg and Taylor Mountain, he's going through Snoqualmie Pass, it's really scenic. He had so many opportunities to dispose of her anywhere else, but it points to how significant the Taylor Mountain site was for Ted, considering so many victims were found there. He was willing to travel and take a risk, really, with traveling with a victim in his car for so long that he needed to dispose of the victims at this location. We then go to Kathy Parks, and this is another long-distance victim. He does admit later that he intentionally went far away to kind of throw off investigators or detectives. He wanted to think he wanted them to think that whoever was putting bodies on the mountain, it was more than one person, or they had a different MO. The drive was, let's see, scroll down. So it was a 262-mile drive from Seattle to Oregon State University, where he abducts Kathy Parks. It's 4 hours and 22 minutes. And then you think, he abducts her, he hits her over the head, renders her unconscious. He ties her up with rope. He was specific about leaving her tied and bound. and that he didn't necessarily have to repeatedly knock her unconscious because she was tied up. But he drives then back from Corvallis to the Taylor Mountain site, which is a little bit under 4 hours because he's not going all the way back to Seattle. And again, that long drive. For Kathy specifically, we note that her skull shows significant fractures when we're comparing her skull to that of Linda Ann Healy or prior victims. I don't like to speculate, but part of me believes that earlier, when Ted was denying that he didn't have any anger towards women, part of me feels that what we're seeing here is significant fractures. The maxilla bone is actually not one whole bone here. It's 2 kind of solid bones that are fused pretty well to the skull. And then you have smaller bones kind of in the nasal and orbital areas. But the maxilla was never found. It was completely removed. And then the mandible itself, the mandible is that lower part of the skull, that was found, but it was found detached from the skull. Brenda Ball, sorry, I just have to scroll. So she was abducted from, from the Flame Tavern. This was in Burien, Washington, which is kind of the south side of Seattle. There's really nothing that puts Bundy in that area as far as I can be seen, so that leads us to believe that this is also another victim of opportunity. Although he was very organized, despite the victims being of opportunity, he was very organized with how he carried out his MO and what he did with his victims. He was able to actually convince Ball to come to his apartment for drinks. He kind of started this off of, hey, this is just a social hangout. Let's just go back to my place for drinks. He states, whether this is true or not, he states that initially their encounter was consensual, but that once she had fallen asleep or had had too much to drink, he was not satisfied, and he then kills her in his apartment by strangulation. To then later dispose at the Taylor Mountain site as well. And important to also note that her skull, like Kathy Park's, was significantly fractured as well, more so than the other victims. This is the Taylor Mountain site. The picture on your guys' right is actually from King County during the initial search of that crime scene. And it was a very, very large crime scene. There was a lot found there. There is a lot of people, it's been reported that only skulls were found at Taylor Mountain, thus kind of bringing into question whether he decapitated victims, left their skulls at Taylor Mountain, and then the rest of their remains were brought elsewhere. But as I'm digging through the case files, it's very evident that there were bones found, even large bones. So whether he decapitated victims or not, we're finding their remains in large portions. The picture here on the left, I actually went to the Taylor Mountain site when I visited Washington last year. I don't know if I even have the words right now at this point in the presentation to describe the feeling when I was there. It's very surreal, knowing what I know. I mean, I think if someone went there and they had no idea what they were standing, where they were standing, it would probably feel very different. But it's definitely very ominous, secluded, and it was a very surreal experience. That's all I can really say. Here's more that was found on Taylor Mountain. I believe the top one, based on the shape, I believe that was Rancourt. So Susan Rancourt, I believe that was hers. And then the second picture down, well, I can't, if I can see.
That's okay.
Either way, those are some of the remains. Pictures taken by King County. If you want to add anything, I feel like I'm just kind of moving. So now, next victim we have is Georgianne Hopkins. So Georgianne Hopkins, she was abducted from sorority, the alley behind her sorority. Again, 5 blocks away from Ted's residence. So I want to bring up the picture. Here we go. So this is important. So I don't know how well you guys can see from where you are, but Beta Pi here on the end was where Georgianne went into to speak with a friend of hers. She spent roughly an hour there, came out of that, out of Beta, to return to her sorority house here at the very end, Kappa Alpha Theta. So as she's walking, you can see these 2 cars here. These are vehicles belonging to victims that witnessed Georgianne walking down this alley. And then right where, there's this kind of like path here is where Georgianne encounters Bundy, or where we assume she encountered Bundy, based on the witness reports. From there, Ted actually directs her back down the alley towards, you see, 47th Street, where that initial Beta Pi fraternity is. So he directs her that way. Of course, he is starting to implement his ruse of crutches, faking an ailment so that he'll gain, sympathy from victims, especially women like Georgianne, who were very kind and helpful women that wanted to help people. So this is what he does. He encounters Georgianne. He's on crutches. He's dropping books, briefcase. She goes to help him. So he directs her down to the 47th Street. And then, I wish I had the other streets. But anyways, they turn towards 17th Avenue northeast, and then they go about another block. So it was a pretty long walk, and he's on crutches. I went to the alley around the same time of night that Bundy had abducted Georgianne. It was pretty late. I think it was around 11 p.m. And I walked it, and I timed it. And it was literally from the time he had encountered Georgianne to the time he got her to his Volkswagen, it was about 7 minutes. So he had a good chunk of time to, talk with her. Just found that very interesting.
Can anybody, let's do a question, wake everybody up. This is a lot of information, we know. Can anybody give me the exact date of birth for Ted Bundy? Can anybody give me the day and month?
It's November something, the 20th, I think, or, I don't know, mine's 19th, I know he was born around me.
You're very close. Can anybody tell me how many death sentences Ted Bundy received?
Well, when's his birthday?
Great.
All right, you got me. It's November 24th, 1946. All right, death sentences. How many?
1.
No.
Oh.
This is how many he was sentenced to, is what I mean.
Okay.
Yes. Technically, I know where you're coming from. I do. Can anybody name the state where he was sentenced to death?
Florida.
Very good. All right, now, nobody knows how many death sentences he received?
3. Is it 11?
Who said that? Yes, ma'am, you are correct. It was 3. Come up and get your sticker.
Was that for the Chi Omega?
Yes, ma'am. Well, Chi Omega was what he was, yes, he did receive 2 death sentences for that, and then 1 for the little girl. Very good. All right, awesome. Yeah.
Thank you for sprinkling in questions.
Yeah.
I get so hyper-focused
It's very
on
dense
it.
information we get. We really appreciate you guys hanging in there with us. we might kind of want to move through a little faster. Lake Sammamish, this is a very big, important part in the Bundy story, so we'll give you a little more detail about this.
Yeah, and you can even help me with this one too. Let me scroll down to my notes.
Okay.
Okay, so Lake Sammamish is another development stage, I feel like, in Ted Bundy. For whatever reason, this day, so this is July 14th, 74. This was a huge day at Lake Sammamish. There's reportedly 40,000 people there for an event, I forget the name of the event. But, you know, whether Bundy knew that there was a lot of people at this lake or not is, you know, we don't know. He had been to this lake before for water skiing. But again, this just really seems very random. So this is the day where he abducts 2 women on the same day. On this day, when he arrives at Lake Sammamish, he's seen wearing a white t-shirt and yellow shorts. He's approaching women, saying his name, you know, approaching, saying, "Hi, I'm Ted." And then he's using a ruse of, you know, I need help getting my sailboat onto my car. You know, he's got his arm in a cast. So he's approaching different women. You know, after a while, you know, he's seeming a little discouraged because there were a few women that turned him down. But then he approaches Janice Ott. And I don't know if I should show that here. So these are the 2 victims. Janice Ott, over here,
Very
the
petite.
blonde.
You can see how small she was.
Yeah. So, anyways, he convinces her to come with him to help with the sailboat. I believe she had a bicycle, so he put her bicycle on his bike rack on the back of his VW. She hops in, and he takes her to the Issaquah site, which is another site separate from Taylor Mountain. I think sometimes people get them confused because they're kind of general in the same area. They're about 15 minutes apart from one another. He then returns. And this time when he returns, he's not wearing the white shirt and yellow shorts. He's changed his clothes. And we know this because the witness who saw him wearing his initial outfit saw him when he came back and reported him wearing gray turtleneck and long pants, like not summer attire. So clearly we know something went awry. He had to change his clothes.
Did he still have his arm in a cast?
Yes. So then he approached her.
Yeah, I think he did have an cast at that site. That's a great question. Because,
Yeah.
he's using a different ruse, but he's still kind of trying to look like he's disabled and needs help getting this a non-existent boat to the
Right, exactly.
to his house.
So then he approaches Denise Naslund, does the same kind of conversation with her, and transports her to the same Issaquah location.
It's interesting to note with this crime, there's question over whether or not the victims saw one another. In other words, that he abducted one and then kept her alive and then abducted the other one and brought her back. Now, there's speculation that Ted did admit to doing that to one of the investigators, but then he later recanted. So if he did make that admission, then he may have backpedaled because he realized it was not going to look good for him when it came down to it. So yeah, I find this one of the most interesting kill sites, especially because he abducted 2 women in one day. You want to tell him about how he acted after that when he got back home?
Oh yeah. So he returns home after these abductions and killings. He takes the bike rack off of his car and he puts it onto his girlfriend's car. And we can only assume that the reason for doing this is to, throw off anyone who may have seen his car. It's going to be less identifiable if it looks different. It doesn't have that bike rack on it. He then goes to dinner with his wife, or his girlfriend, and his stepdaughter Molly. He eats what? 2 hamburgers.
2 hamburgers.
And I think there's more. Like
He ate
just
more
grabs
things with
this.
So if you think about murdering 2 people, how much energy that would take and how much that would take out of you. And he had been out probably in the sun all day, and I'm sure he was exhausted. exhausted. And the fact that his girlfriend remembered that is something that's really interesting to me. She remembered how ravenous he was after committing both of these crimes. And again, he was extremely cocky at this time in his life because he actually gave his first name, to the women he was approaching. And that's how that killing spree, or those 2 murders, were started to be called the Ted murders. So, and that's how police started to collate the names of their suspects that drove that type of car. Very important. Yes, very important.
All right, so after the Lake Sammamish attacks, the heat is kind of turned up. I think Ted is starting to sense, there's a surge, there's media, there's these listings stating that someone by the name of Ted with an arm cast with a VW was approaching women, and of course, obviously, they're reporting the woman missing. So he gets out of Dodge. And leading up to this, he had sent applications to the University of Utah for law school. So in the fall of 1974, September 2nd to be specific, is Bundy's first initial move to Utah. He drove down in his VW, purchasing gas in Tacoma, Pendleton, and then Boise, Iowa. So we got half of our presentation done. Thank you for those that hung in it through it.
Absolutely did.
You're fascinating, thank you.
Yes, yeah.
I wish we had another, hour or two and another day, but I mean, there's so much.
There's a lot of information. So do you have any questions before we have to break up as far as Ted's travels, the escapes that he had in Colorado?
Was Colorado where we jumped out of the
Yes,
courtroom?
that was Aspen. So he escaped twice in Colorado. And I've actually been to the courthouse where he jumped. It's from a 2nd floor window, but it feels like 3 floors because the building almost leans back. But yeah, you can see how he could easily run down the street because Aspen's so small. Then of course, they caught him a few days later because he got lost.
Yeah.
And I really think he was bad with directions. So what we were going to show was that he drove in a straight line all the time, and he always followed the highway. So I just don't think he had a good sense of direction. He also escaped from the Glenwood Springs jail, and that's how he made his way all the way up to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and then back down to Florida where he committed his final crimes, the Tallahassee Chi-Omega murders, where he killed 2 women, had 2 survivors, and then he killed a woman down the street, and then he killed a young girl who was 12 in Lake City. But again, along the panhandle of Florida, he went from the left side to the right side and then back to the left side again where he got arrested for his final time. Yes?
The lady that escaped, that actually threw herself out of the car.
Yes.
Was that at a mall or what state was that in?
Yes, that was in Utah. That was in Murray, Utah, at the Fashion Place Mall. That was Carol Durant.
You guys have been an excellent audience. Please come up here and pick something that you like for making it all the way through. We have some great Bundy faces up here. We have a bookmark. We have some Bundy, I think they're stickers or they may just be little things you can choose. And we have a little Bundy car. So you know what? First come, first serve. Everybody pick one item, so make sure everybody gets something. Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming. We're sorry we couldn't get to the end of everything.
And that it was so long.
Yeah, it was very dense, and you guys did a great job. Great questions, too. Thank you for those questions.